Welcome, everyone. This podcast is called Unveiling. My name is Jordan Bain, and tonight I have the honor of having my sister, Ariana Bain, on the podcast. We're going to be discussing right use of mind. Personally, I'm a modern mystery school kabbalah teacher, senior guide, healer, and teacher in the modern mystery school. And what we're doing with this podcast tonight and with all these podcasts is really opening up deeper teachings and understandings of, what is life? What are the mysteries? What's really going on? So thank you for watching. Thank you for joining us. My sister, Ariana, works with people who want to bring conscious change to the world, but people who struggle with burnout, anxiety, stress, and addiction that holds them back from having greater impact. She's a healer and guide in the Modern Mystery School, and she holds a master's in environmental science from Yale University and a bachelor's from Wesleyan University. So, Ari, is there anything else you want to say before we get started?
No, that's great. I'm really glad to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, my pleasure. Absolutely. So I'd love to hear from you what your life was like before you found the Modern Mystery School. Before you got into this work and doing what you do now, just tell us a little bit about your life.
Great. Yeah. So I'm really glad to be here. Hi, everyone. And, my life before I found the Modern Mystery School was one that was still filled with a lot of different spiritual practices. I'd always spent my life on the one hand doing spiritual work and on the other hand studying things like science. And, as you said in your intro, I went and got a master's of science and really wanted to change the world through sustainability and through helping transform the environment and how humans relate to it. But what I found over the course of doing that and over the course of getting really great training and education was that there was a lot that was missing from how we as humans were approaching sustainability and the environment and environmental justice and issues like that. And I was really curious about what else could be part of the picture. And I started studying different spiritual things alongside that. And over time, over a number of years of doing that, found that the other spiritual things that I was doing were really wonderful and they were really great for my personal practices, but they weren't really transforming what I was doing professionally. And so what brought me to the mystery school was that I was looking for something that would help me bridge between the personal transformation that I knew that I needed and then the outward transformation that I knew that the world needed, and could provide a grounded bridge between both of those rather than just being a professional practice on the one side that I was, doing through science and through business. Or on the other hand, being like a spiritual practice, quote unquote. I wanted something that was going to blend the two of them together in a way that was really effective and in a way that was going to have a greater impact in the world than I would have otherwise been able to have.
Very cool. So what for you, how do you see the direct connection happening between the mystery school and what is it that makes that connection? What is the bridge?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And that's still always an unfolding thing for me because it's part of the nature of studying the mysteries is that it's, I never arrive at one answer and stay at that answer. But, based on my current level of unfolding after a decade of doing that work, is that bridge has to do with being able to connect between body and soul and spirit and clear out the blockages to us having that be a natural and organic, authentic flow between all of those all the time. And what I had found before the mystery school was that I could go and quote unquote do spiritual practices. I could go meditate or I could go chant or, I could go do yoga asana or something like that. And I would have temporary connections with spirit. But once I was not doing those practices, say, I was working on my corporate consulting company or, I was writing peer-reviewed papers for scientific journals or something along those lines, that connection was no longer there. It wasn't something that could bridge between them. And so what I found with the Modern Mystery School.
Why is that though? What's going on where, you get off your yoga mat and then it doesn't really connect to what you're doing in your business? Why? I don't know if I have an answer for that either, but I always ask this question of myself. And I pose this question to clients as well, because, there's something about shouldn't it?
Yeah, well, it does to an extent. It's not like it doesn't have an impact on it, but it's more about how long lasting that impact can be before you return to baseline and you need the practice again.
Right.
And for me, I did a lot of yoga. I even studied yoga in India for a summer while I was also there doing my master's research. And, I spent a summer in Mysore. And yoga is amazing. And doing 2 hours of yoga a day made me feel really good. That was a few years before I found the mystery school. And it did a ton for me. I would never, ever say that it wasn't like a wonderful practice for me. But once I no longer had time to study yoga and practice yoga asana 2 hours a day under a master teacher and their supervision and guidance, that effect started to wear away. So it's like, 2 hours a day in the morning of doing yoga, and then, an hour in the evening of doing meditation and pranayama type work. Like, that did a lot for me, but that's 3 hours. And most people, myself included, once you get out of this setting of being a student, or growing up or something like that, you don't necessarily have 3 hours a day for intense spiritual practice every day, just as like your basic maintenance. That was just like my basic maintenance to feel connected.
Yeah. Anyone with kids definitely does not have 3 hours a day to meditate and do yoga.
No, you have negative hours per day.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, there's something about the mystery school where we don't need a lot of time to have a huge impact in our personal energy and then what we can do in the world. So
yeah, particularly because I found with the practices is that, the reason why we need so much baseline spiritual practice with other systems is because they're helping us connect, but they aren't necessarily helping to resolve the reasons why we're disconnected in the first place. Like they're maintenance for functioning, but they don't dive into all the different ways in which we are ourselves subconsciously blocking the light or subconsciously blocking that connection within us. So that was the real transformation for me with the mystery school, with getting life activated, with getting initiated, with studying universal kabbalah, was that those blockages started to resolve themselves. Yeah. And because those started to resolve themselves, it didn't require so much effort to stay connected. And my efforts that I did have the time to invest in, because I still meditated and did other spiritual practices, those efforts took me a lot farther in terms of where they would take me within my being. I could get past just the stuff that was blocking me into deeper spiritual work within myself.
Right. For sure. What, you studied sustainability and you had a sustainability consulting practice for years before you went doing mystery school work full time. How do you see the connection between sustainability specifically and the mystery school? I'm sure it's related to some of the stuff we've already been talking about, but I'd love to hear you say more about that, because your whole thing was sustainability for like a decade. Yeah,
exactly. And for longer, since I was, a teenager and a kid, I've always wanted to change the way that we relate to the environment and to address the amount of pain both that humans are feeling, but also then the amount of pain and disconnect between humans and the environment. And so that was part of what drove me to find the mystery school, was that, there's actually a pretty decent level of acknowledgement within the sustainability world that there's something missing from what we're doing with sustainability. There's an acknowledgement that essentially we have all the technology and all of the technical physical tools that we need to not just sort of like fix things, but to actually have what's called in sustainability like a regenerative world, to have our systems create more energy than they use, to create more clean water than they use, to create abundant food for everybody. Like, we actually have all of that 100% sorted out on the technological side. Like, we could do it a little bit better, sure, but we have the fundamentals already there. And so there's this understanding that it's like, if we already have all these here and we already have all the technology we need, we have all the knowledge that we need, there hasn't been a major breakthrough in our understanding of climate change in 40 years. We've known everything that's going on with climate change for 40 plus years at this point. And so it's like, okay, if we know that we have all these issues and we also, on the other hand, have all the solutions to the issues, like, what gives, essentially? And so the connection between sustainability and the mystery school is that what I see is that people don't necessarily recognize that the reason why we aren't doing what we need to do isn't because of the technological side. It's because of human behavior and human will, and really like lacking the will to start to make these better decisions. And right now, we're making these little increments, like we're doing a little bit better, but that little bit better isn't really catching up to the lot of damage that humans are doing to the planet at the same time. And so that connection is that what we really want to be able to do in the sustainability world is really actually change the trajectory of things. And what I found with the mystery school was that I was like, this really is our only hope in a lot of ways, because we have to change humans we don't that's our biggest challenge. And the only way that I really know to change human behavior for good and based on freedom and choice rather than, draconian laws or telling people what to do is through empowering them. And that's what the system does.
Absolutely. Yeah. No one really wants to be told what to do, whether it's through laws or policies or really anything. So when we look at the mystery school and these tools being related to sustainability, sustainability can be a different kind of buzzword for different people too. So, I like to think of sustainability as having a really beautiful, clean world that's not toxic, and we can all live in it. And like our children's children can have a beautiful world also, rather than it be some sort of toxic, radioactive filled, poison filled, pesticide filled, chemical everywhere, like lack of resources and deserts everywhere kind of planet. So hopefully, the majority of people can get behind a vision of like a beautiful green world where like everyone has enough food to eat and that sort of thing. So don't want to like depoliticize the concept of sustainability because, half the planet seems to think like climate change doesn't exist or is not a thing and all that. So just to like take all the politics out of it to something we can all kind of agree on and like see eye to eye on is like, yeah, we all want that. And that there's a way to get there, and it's not just a spiritual way to get there. There's like real things we have to do differently but yet we're not doing those things because of where we're all at emotionally, psychologically, spiritually. Like we're not making certain decisions because of our mind and our will, which is why we're doing this podcast today, talking about right use of mind, which is kind of like the will, but a little will and mind are not really the same thing in the mystery school tradition. So we'll get there. We'll go into that a little bit.
But with that, I think that I love how you distilled it. And the thing, I've done a lot of corporate trainings with people from all sorts of different political and belief backgrounds. And I like to distill all this work down into like at a basic level, it's about clean water, clean air, and clean food for everybody. And there's really nobody I've ever met in my life that when you break it down to that is like, no, I don't want that for myself, or no, I don't want that for other people. Like everybody's like, yeah, that seems like a pretty good idea. I think that we should all get that as a baseline experience of being around.
For sure. So let's talk about the will and the mind. So if we're going to talk about the will, we kind of have to talk about God or goddess or source or something greater, because will isn't just this thing that like pops up unbidden within humanity. Like will comes from somewhere and it does something. We say in the mystery school, like the will is what moves the mind, rather than the way that most humans operate is that the mind moves the will. So, when we define the mind is actually maybe almost harder to define than the will, although we don't have to talk about God necessarily to talk about the mind. I mean, we do in reality, but we could fudge it and try and talk about it some other way. How would you for our audience like talk about mind and will? We can go back and forth on this.
I mean, there's so many ways, right? Like there's so many different ways to talk about the mind and to define that. But, perhaps for the context of today, one of the most tangible and easy to understand approaches to the mind is thinking of the higher self and thinking of like the relationship between ourselves and sort of our everyday consciousness. And then kind of like that highest and best version of ourselves that we know is there sometimes and, seems to sometimes come in and guide our hand or, guide our decisions, guide our intuition.
So is that the mind? That higher self?
Is that the mind? No, I wouldn't say that is the mind, but it's a way to understand the mind, because that higher self is like an antenna for the mind at a lot of different levels, because there's so many different ways to do it or to think of it. But, it's like the higher self, the more we clean out the pathways between our everyday consciousness and the higher self, the more we have like this clear antenna and clear receiver for what is going on with the higher mind, whether we see that as our individual higher mind or the connection to like the sort of like broader universal higher mind.
So how do we do that in the mystery school? How do we clear that connection out?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many ways, right? But in its essence, what we're dealing with is that, us as physical beings, by the time we're adults, we're usually pretty cut off from higher self, right? It's like we're pretty cut off from ourselves as soul. We're pretty cut off from ourselves as spirit. And, in this tradition, we differentiate between those, that we have both a soul and a spirit. And that the soul is like an intermediary between us and spirit, and all the vast intelligence and wisdom that we hold as infinite and eternal spiritual beings. So, it's like within this tradition, there's a lot of different ways to do it, but usually it starts with life activation and with a deeper connection to the spirit and the spiritual blueprints. But so much of where people go from there depends on things like, getting initiated and accelerating the process and the light that comes through that system through using tools to connect with their higher self, like sanctuary meditation, and regularly bringing the higher self in and starting to actually develop like real communication and consciousness of where the higher self is directing us.
So, we have these systems in the mystery school like Kabbalah, that talks about all the different levels of ourselves, like the different dimensions. When we have a system like Kabbalah to structure this conversation, it's a lot easier to have this conversation. But, this podcast is not designed just for mystery school initiates who have taken Kabbalah to, have a discussion about things we know that we love, but really to open up the mysteries for everyone. So, when we look at something like the Tree of Life, which is a structure where we talk about there's different archetypes, there's different aspects. We say that all of these are aspects of the subconscious mind. There's the physical level, there's the soul level, there's the spirit level, and each of these has different aspects to it. And spirit is like the true self, who we really are, and then soul has all these different components. There's sort of like a higher part and a lower part of the soul. The higher part of the soul is more like the ethical part of the soul that like struggles with the mental decisions of how we think and how our minds operate. And then the lower part of the soul is more like the emotional. It's like closer to the animal nature of humans. And it's more like the subconscious, like the dream life, like the lower mind, and like our instincts and our passions and our drives that really fuel us and motivate us on that human personality level. So when we're talking about body, soul, and spirit, we have like very specific things that we're talking about metaphysically. It's not just like these different, it's not a philosophical, poetic, metaphorical thing only. It's like a whole scientific system that we can actually understand and study and get into. Now, we're not going to like get into it in a podcast in 45 minutes, but just that exists. And so when we say that the mind and the will are connected, most people, their will is influenced by what they take in through their senses and what's going on inside their mind. And as initiates, we say we need to turn that on its head and start using our will, which is connected to these things you've been talking about, like higher self, soul, and spirit. And we need to put that like into our mind. And we do that through these different techniques, but especially it's the path of initiation. Initiation is like our best tool to start working with the mind so that we can have a greater influence over the mind. And then it's like, well, why would we need to do that? Oh, the mind is like often working against us.
Absolutely.
The mind is not really, most people are not very good friends with their mind.
No. And there's a lot of confusion there, I think, about what is the mind? Because most people, if you were to ask them to define what the mind is, would be referring to their subconscious mind for the most part. They'd be referring to their programs, to their repetitive thoughts, to the ways in which they have adapted their mental faculties to being here and being physical in the world, being a painful and difficult place for a lot of people. And so it's like we confuse that, like the programs and the patterns and the masks that we've taken on as with our mind. And when really they're not the same thing. It's like those are like our subconscious programming. But our actual mind, as you're referring to, it's like that starts to get illuminated through the path of initiation and through Kabbalah and through healing the subconscious on a lot of different levels. It's like our true mind usually has very little to do with the subconscious, very little to do with like those don't really hold a candle to each other.
Say more about that in terms of like, what are the mental blockages that a lot of people hit up against when they're just living? We don't need to say anything that's happening, but if we're talking about the mind and how we use our minds, like what do people bump into that stops them mentally?
Yeah. I mean, there's so many things I see with people, but just to name a few, like a really common thing for people, even when they're really high functioning, is like checking boxes, like defining what they're supposed to be doing in life
Mhm.
based on what they've experienced before. And, again, by the time we're adults, we often forget sort of the programming that we've gone through over the course of our lives, like all of the just minute to minute feedback
Mhm.
and connections we've had with other people that start to like shape us towards certain directions. And sometimes those are obvious, but sometimes it's much more subtle. And, you know, somebody that I know once put it really well is like, ask yourself who you would want to be, like who your child self would like you being as an adult, like who your child self like wouldn't hate. And most people have no, they like there something was lost in the process. And usually that's because of the subconscious mind. And that
Mhm.
subconscious mind reflects back to us in all these ways of,
Mhm.
boxes that we want to check, things that we feel like we should be doing, based on other people's expectations, things that we think are going to make us successful, things that we, whatever it is, some people think that being really fit is going to make them successful. Some people think that getting fancy degrees is going to make them successful. Some people think making a startup company in their parents' garage is going to make them successful. But it's like anytime we're turning to somebody else outside of us for approval and for like a validation of what we're doing, that's usually showing us that there's a distortion happening.
Mhm. Yeah. So, and there's so many directions we can go with that. Um, when I think about this stuff, I think about the concept of integrity. Like integrity comes to mind. Like what does it mean to be in integrity with yourself in terms of your mind?
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely a lot of different ways to understand that, but touching into what we were talking about before, this concept that, our own, what we conceive of as our mind is in its true essence is really ideally something that we let go of in terms of letting go of our thoughts and allowing in our higher self and allowing that to be a receiver for higher consciousness. And so it's like to be in integrity with that really means to know yourself and to really know who you are, like really deeply, and to be able to consistently act in a way that is like coherent with that knowledge of self. And so that really takes a lot of deep work to understand, like, who am I,
Mm.
like, and work with some of life's deep questions.
I feel like a lot of people have gifts. Now, gifts is like a big topic that isn't like really our main focus tonight, but a lot of people have gifts, and those gifts can often be related to things in their mind. Like what are your superpowers? Like people like to say that these days. Like what's your superhero ability? What are you really good at in your mind? And in the mystery school, we say that these gifts are very connected to our purpose, very
So
connected to our soul, very connected to things that we're meant to do. So can you comment on that, and like the connection between the mind and gifts and what people are doing in their lives?
yeah, that one's really tricky because, there's a whole group of people who aren't in touch with their gifts for whatever reason, and
Mm-hmm.
that's its own challenge. But even when people are in touch with their gifts, we have the challenge that we live in a society, again, where most of our feedback is trying to make us really small and put us into specific, like, little boxes of who we are, and like a very one-dimensional existence in terms of how we define ourselves. And so it's so common for people to take their gifts and then say, okay, what job can I get with this? Or
Mm,
what's an existing career path? And
right.
what I see with a lot of people is that when it comes to like having a career path for something that we're here to do, the things that the world needs the most right now in order for humanity to evolve, for us to eventually, move towards, what we call in the mystery school Shambhala, or a state of world peace,
Mm,
we don't have established career paths for that. It's like our gifts aren't going to fit into one neat little box where we're just going to go and do one thing for a whole career, or even for, for a year or two. Most of the people who are here now, who are coming into adulthood, aren't here to be in a career path. They're here to be very multidimensional and to express in a lot of different ways. And that's a real challenge for people with gifts, is kind of like that making yourself small, being like, okay, where does my gift fit into this existing puzzle? Rather than asking, what kind of true education for my soul do I need so that I'm not trying to make myself small and fit into these little boxes. And instead I can see the puzzle for what it is and start to shape my own life.
I mean, you could unpack everything you just said for a whole episode, but seeing the puzzle for what it is, say more about that. I mean, what is this puzzle? What is the puzzle of our lives? How does that relate to the mystery school? How does that relate to our mind? How does that relate to our gifts and our purpose?
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, we could unpack that in a lot of different ways, but I'll take it in one direction, and
Sure.
you can always add in some more, or we can explore some additional ones. But
Mm-hmm.
from the perspective of the mystery school, and what we've been talking about with the getting deeper contact with the higher self, and with understanding our purpose more and our blueprints as spirit, it's that whole process, the path of the initiate, the path of shifting from our normal everyday level of awareness and consciousness, which is usually relatively limited for most people, and shifting over a period of years of applying these tools into really living from our higher self. That higher self is like literally a higher perspective on what's going on. And, one of my favorite ways to think about gaining a higher perspective of, of the puzzle of life, of whatever it is that's going on, is that, the process of life activation and initiation elevates us above our subconscious mind. It elevates us above like all the junk that we've taken on over the course of our lives. And it allows us to see what it is, rather than kind of like hanging out inside that junk as just a physical person and trying to name it through therapy or different treatment programs and kind of like point it and be able to describe it. It elevates us up above it so that we can actually see it for what it is. And it doesn't mean we don't have a lot of work to do. Because even if you see what the puzzle is of, of the direction of the world, of what you need to be doing, there's still a lot of work. It's not in any way eliminating the amount of work we need to do. And usually it makes you more inspired to do even more work. But it's elevating us up to that perspective so that we can see it for what it is, and we can see our lives for what they are, and we can see our choices for what they are, and then act from that higher perspective on a consistent basis.
I mean, yeah, having the higher perspective, I was rewatching one of my podcasts with Sisma Siddhartha back in January, and he was just really simply being like, I used to be this and I used to be that, but I didn't have enough like of a high vibration to really have the higher perspective. I just didn't have it. Like I wasn't life activated. I wasn't initiated. I hadn't done kabbalah. I wasn't able to access that higher perspective consistently to really do anything with it. So I was successful within a certain narrow definition in the world, but those other dimensions of life were just not really available to me.
Absolutely.
And I think that's how a lot of people are living. Like maybe they have this piece of the puzzle figured out, but it's only, seeing life through this little lens that doesn't change that much. It's just not really that interesting.
Yeah. And it's most importantly, it's not that fulfilling.
Right.
And a lot of the ways that people can understand when they're sort of butting up against this is when they're doing things that are supposedly successful or outwardly successful, and then they're still feeling burnt out, or they're still feeling not satisfied or not fulfilled in what they're doing. It's like, that's a really good indicator of like, there's part of my being I'm not in touch with yet. There's part of my existence that I haven't tapped into yet, which doesn't make anything that they're currently doing inherently wrong or bad or like they're off track. It's just like, there's just more. And that more is missing from their lives, and their joy and fulfillment and connection are tied up in understanding what that more is.
Yeah. And when someone is in that space where they're not really grasping what they could be doing, a lot of people aren't aware of that at first, but then eventually something starts like they start waking up. They start growing in their concept of like, there really could be more. And a lot of people get locked in their mind in that journey. They get stuck mentally. So, we were talking earlier about like box checking and, like when you should on yourself and you say, I should be doing this and I should be doing that, and getting stuck in that sort of a loop. But there's also all the different like philosophies and religions that people get stuck in, the ways that they think that this is what life is about. And anything can be a philosophy or religion, not just something, I studied Greek philosophy and I am a Christian, but like we can make science a religion. We can make our parents' belief systems a religion. We can make, our relationship with our friends a philosophy. I think that on the weekends, I probably should go out drinking because that's like what my friends like to do. And then, oh, I can't think straight come Monday morning. So let's just forget about that whole life purpose thing until next weekend when I do the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, that's a huge trap for 95% of society. That's stuck in a cycle of just going out and like blowing off steam in whatever way. And then the steam is blown off, then they do the cycle again. And maybe they blow it off through like going hiking a lot, or through doing lots of sports, or through hanging out with people, or through being alone, or maybe they do it through overworking. I'm just going to work 80 hours a week and then keep myself in this mental loop that keeps going. So what do you feel like is helpful for people to hear when they're starting out on that journey of awakening? Like what would you say to a client who's just coming out of one of those cycles and they're in your office and maybe they want to get life activated, maybe they're interested in initiation, maybe they've seen this podcast or something like that? What would you say to them?
What would I say to them about sort of like the early steps in the journey?
Yeah. Like how would you encourage them, and how would you talk to them?
Yeah. I mean, it's always a very personal thing, in terms of
Mm-hmm.
what's most supportive to people to hear. But so often when people are early in their journey, it's like, it's both helpful to understand what's going to start to shift things for them, because tools like the life activation and further healings that we do, like full spirit activation, they start like a whole process of really profound shifts. But at the same time, those shifts aren't always obvious, because, what I was talking about before, where, starting to do this work and receiving these activations, even before initiation, really does start to elevate your perspective. But then it really depends on how much junk people have to deal with to start to clear out these connections. And so for some people, their life is transformed the next day after a life activation. They look totally different. They feel totally different. But for other people, it sometimes is a period of months, in order to like really actually start to feel the effects of the life activation. And so what can be really helpful for people to understand is that just like anything that's really important work in your life, that nothing is going to be like an overnight panacea in terms of being able to solve everything and every problem that you have in one go. But at the same time, if people consistently apply these tools, what starts to happen is that they are actually going to get in touch with their higher self. Like that is going to start to come in and guide their consciousness more, and guide their mind more, and guide their thoughts more, guide their choices more. And that, the process of initiation is really the strongest tool that we have for speeding that up, because most people who find the mystery school have no point of reference for what accelerating their spiritual learning by 10 times would actually mean. Because most people, by the time they're adults, aren't really substantially spiritually learning. They may be going through lessons, they may be going through experiences, but they aren't necessarily actually really experiencing something, learning from it, and then moving on. They experience something, learn from it, get stuck back in it, experience something, learn from it, get stuck back in it. And
how dare you tell me I'm not learning spiritual lessons? I'm so offended. I'm turning off this podcast right now.
It's true. Because that was what I experienced in my own life prior to mystery school, is that I was like, I'm having cool spiritual experiences and I'm touching into different parts of my being, but am I really learning? Am I really gaining a new level of mastery here? And the people who come into my office are people who have the humility to be like, yeah, there might be something available to me that I haven't touched into yet. Because it's not just like, we're not yanking in people off the street being like, hey, you got to come to my office. You got to talk to me about this, this life activation thing or this initiation thing. It's, it's people who are genuinely curious and genuinely open to like, oh, I wonder what would happen if I opened myself up to being a more multidimensional being. If I opened myself up to these deeper aspects of myself and started to explore and, see what I'm really about.
Yeah. I mean, that exploration and discovering what I'm really about is the essence of knowing ourselves, which is the sort of the mandate of being a mystery school initiate, is that you have to know yourself.
Exactly.
You're saying I'm committing that I want to make this like part of my job. Yeah. I'm not just going to have this be a hobby anymore. I'm going to, take this commitment. I'm going to take this step that commits me to knowing myself in the light, like bringing light, which is awareness or consciousness, into myself. And I'm going to do something with it. I'm going to do something practical with it. Now, what am I going to do that's practical with it? that's going to be unique. I can't say when I initiate someone what they're going to go do with that light that comes into their life. I don't know. We'll see. Like maybe even the light doesn't know what they're going to do with it. Maybe even source or the universe or their spirit guides or whatever we want to talk about. Maybe no one fully truly knows like what they're going to do when they get that 10 times more light or more empowerment. It's going to be related to their purpose. They're going to step forward toward their purpose. They're going to step forward toward their gifts, toward why they're really here. And they're going to hit up against stuff in their mind as they go. They're going to hit up against mental blockages. They're going to need to know those parts of themselves before they can know other parts of themselves. So there's that journey to knowing different levels of mind. Do you want to comment on that? Like as someone steps forward on the path and they continue to progress, what would you say to people as they're further along in their journey?
In terms of the mind and what they're going to encounter with that?
I mean, we can't summarize for everyone, but just in terms of like our approach.
Yeah. So, there's a lot of different levels in terms of how we work with this in the mystery school, but part of the essence of it is starting to have your own experience. As Jordan was just talking about, like there's no one blueprint that's like, okay, here's exactly what you personally are going to experience with this. We know archetypally the kinds of stages that people go through in their own development, but typically speaking, it's like our initial stages, with an initiation really have to do with like clearing out a lot of the things in our personal and physical and emotional lives that aren't serving us, and seeing those patterns for what they are and starting to see those choices in like much clearer resolution in front of us and being able to say like, what, this is serving me and this isn't serving me, and starting to clear out all the things that aren't serving us in a very like vivid kind of way, not necessarily just like, oh, what's not like serving me spiritually, but no, like what are the habits that aren't serving me daily? What are the patterns that aren't serving me daily? What are the mental patterns and the thought patterns that aren't supporting this higher version of myself? What are the repeat negative thoughts that I have about myself that are undermining my capacity to function each day? And it's like those initial stages start to work at that level. But as we start to work at a higher level, as you go further down the path of initiation, you start to really delve into these questions of like, really, who are you as spirit? And like, really, what's the vast intelligence and wisdom that's there, that's contained within your spirit? And you start to actually be able to explore the realms of your soul and the realms of your spirit, and start to even have your own personal experiences of like, well, what does the mind mean at that level? Like what is the subconscious mind that's clouding and distorting things? And again, what's like the higher mind that's contained within that? And I've never found any other tools other than the mystery school that help you even begin to dive into that, because, there's so much work to do usually on the physical side. And that 10 times the light that comes in with initiation, like helps you actually move through those lessons. And within a relatively short period of time, over a few years, helps you get into exploring like the deeper work within your soul and your spirit.
What is the mind at those levels? What is the mind when you get to, when you're 5 years into this work or 3 years into this work and you've done something like Kabbalah and you have a sense of your purpose and you know that things are a certain way, you think things are a certain way. How do people get tripped up as they move forward?
That's a great question. One of the things that I think trips up people at a lot of levels, and there's always continuous learning around, is our concepts, even around what is our purpose. Our concepts around who am I? Because even as you start to unpack, questions like who am I or what is my purpose, there are a lot of different levels to work on. And, what I found personally within this work, 5 years into it, now I'm almost 10 years into it, but 5 years into it, was that I was very purpose driven, and that I had used the tools from Kabbalah to totally build my own life and build the business that I had and build a much greater level of both joy and happiness and success in my own life and impact in terms of the work that I was doing. But those same tools keep going. There's not a point where you're like, wow, great, I have it made. I know everything about myself. You're not like, wow, 5 years of study and I've mastered everything in my life. It's like, no, you keep applying the tools and you start having deeper and deeper realizations about who you are, what you're here to do and what your purpose is. And that doesn't let you stay at a plateau. And that's one of the most amazing things about, studying in a true mystery lineage like the mystery school, is that there's no end to it. There's no stopping point where you're like, I have nothing left to learn. Every day, every week, every month, you are turning to yourself and being like, wow, I'm just beginning. I'm just beginning to really understand myself. I'm just beginning to really understand what I'm doing here. And I'm just at the beginning of the level of like impact and joy that I can have in my life.
Yeah, people sometimes ask me when they're brand new, they're like, so how long is your curriculum? And I'm like, well, as long as you want it to be. I mean, you could just have a life activation and then see you later. Or you could study this for the rest of your life or somewhere in between, because you're studying yourself.
Yeah.
There's not some end to studying yourself. And, that for some people, that seems so obvious. And then for other people, it's like, why would I do that? But either way, they can benefit. Either way, they'll benefit from doing the work. They'll benefit. And the benefits here are really, we're talking about mind today, but the benefits are everywhere in our lives. The first Hermetic principle is mentalism, which is that all is mind. The universe is a mental construct. And that understanding that life is literally created out of the substance of mind, and that, like Nikola Tesla said, if you really want to have power in the universe, like you need to think in terms of like frequency and energy and vibration. We need to think in terms of mind if we want to really claim our true purpose. If we want to really make a big impact, we have to be realizing that it's going to be through our mind. What is it that we can harness in our mind that's going to actually make a difference? What is it when someone's getting initiated that changes in their mind? Yes, their will starts moving in a different direction. Their will starts moving back toward unity instead of into separation. That's a big piece. The mind of an initiate is tuned toward, how do I become whole again? That's my journey, is becoming whole again. And so there's like that rebirth moment of I'm initiated, and there's life before initiation when my mind maybe was not fully my own. My mind was given over to these programs from the past. And then the mind of an initiate is given over toward healing, given over toward progression toward their true self. And all the problems and all the blockages start to come to light. They start to surface, and they start to be examinable in a new way that feels safe, that feels possible. It's like for many people, before they get initiated, their mind feels like maybe an almost impossible minefield, no pun intended. I need to say that, but the minefield of things that they're just going to step on, and then, oops, look where my mind went. Like subconscious triggers of like, oh, there goes my mind. And people are told through like the field of mindfulness, for example, that you should just be aware of that. Just be aware of the trigger. Just let it come to the surface, and then, oh, there it is. And, oh, well, I guess I have a trigger. But in the mystery school, we're like, yeah, but that trigger is like holding all your power back. So maybe we should actually like get rid of that trigger. Maybe we should heal that trigger. And we actually have tools to do that healing so that the mind can really actually start to function better. The mind of initiate being tuned toward wholeness, being tuned toward unity, is a very different kind of force, right? That has a very profound influence on the people around it as well. That mind is not like the mind of most people. That mind, doesn't just have 10 times more light and power, but is a healing force within a family, is a healing force within a neighborhood, is a healing force within a business or a corporation or a government, or whatever structure that mind is part of, starts to work differently as a result of that mind being within it. So there's so many directions we can go from that, but what would you feel if you could share just like one thing with people about like a secret of the mind, something that like really helps you when you're struggling with something in your mind, or when you are approaching your own mind, or when you're trying to think differently about something? What would you share with people?
Yeah, I'd say that one of the best secrets of the mind is understanding that, our process spiritually, like so many people think that, what we need to do when we're meditating is to just let go of our thoughts and to just not think,
Mm-hmm.
and not do anything. And that's true. It's helpful. The early stages of meditation that we teach in the mystery school through the Max Meditation system, those are about letting go of thoughts and things like that. But what so many people forget is that the real goal with meditating isn't to have no thoughts. It's to clear out the junk of our programming in our subconscious mind so that the higher self can come in and so that the higher mind can come in. So, so many people, you talk about, people like Tesla and Einstein, they didn't just go and clear their minds in order to have higher thoughts. There's what they're doing is clearing out their minds so that higher thought can come in. So, one of the things that I've always done in terms of my work, and like you were saying before, like running a consulting company for a long time, is using meditation not just to clear out the mind, but using the meditation to bring in higher level thoughts. And so combining both, passive meditation that clears things out with active meditation that works with that new state of consciousness, because, like Einstein said, it's like you can't solve a problem at the level of consciousness that created it. And so many people don't realize that they have that power within them already to start to shift their consciousness into a different state and then start to actually do work and to operate from that higher state. And that's part of what is needed in order to create any kind of change that you want to make in your life.
Yeah, which brings us back to our original discussion around sustainability as well. How do we create solutions that are going to reach people and change people's minds? But we can't change a mind by forcing a mind to change. That person has to choose to change their mind. And if they don't realize that there is a higher way of thinking, they're not going to, if you don't even know something exists, you can't move into it. Right? If I don't think, I was talking with someone earlier today about different things about marketing my business, for example. And I was saying these things to her and she was like, oh, I didn't even know that existed. Right? So if we don't know something exists, then we can't think that way. And if we're going to pull down like a higher thought form, what if that thought form's never been here before? You can't go read it online. I was also talking with a different client earlier today who was, who was trying to Google images that had come up during a life activation reading. And I was like, I get this all the time, actually, because there's these symbolic images when we do a life activation reading that come out of a person's soul. And they don't really make sense to the mind because they're from a different level of consciousness. And yet we want to understand them, but the only way to understand them is internally. The only way to do that is internally. So dreaming, meditation, having some kind of vision, and the ways to do that reliably are meditation, but we need that initiation to make the connection, to bridge, to penetrate that veil between body and soul, so that we constantly have that connection online. And it's not just something that comes occasionally at a peak spiritual experience, but it's something that's there as our baseline. It's in our foundation all the time. And then we can start to realize not just what does that image mean that I saw in that reading or that Jordan saw in that reading, but that is actually me. Like these things that were once out there somewhere in my aura, my energy field, are now in me, and I'm doing something with them. The things that were visions for me a year ago are now my life. They are now my reality. And all that operates through the mind. There's the mechanism of mind that's always flowing, and in the mystery school, we have the systems that bring that into reality. Kabbalah, initiation, the understanding Hermetic philosophy, so we can have a really pure mind, so we can really stay centered and not get knocked around by different types of thoughts. The mind is a scary place for people. So
absolutely. It's like the mind and the emotions are both a really scary place for people. And so much of this path is bringing those into balance so that there's flow rather than opposition between them. And, with what you're talking about with sustainability and with, how this system is so important is that for so many people, in terms of like having that awareness of where they could even go, like that really does take changing your consciousness, because so much of the kinds of solutions that we need to be creating in the world are not compromises. It's like compromises is it like involves taking two polarities and bringing them downwards to a point of agreement, which usually means that like nobody's really getting what they want, and it's not like nobody really actually wants that. And if we want to have like higher order solutions, what it takes is having two polarities, two like opposing ideas or forces, and taking them and bringing them like up into unity and into synthesis with each other. But you have to be able to have that higher vision for what that could even look like, and to have done enough work within yourself to be able to see that if you want to make that a reality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm reminded of attempting to solve like a lot of industrial problems, like the hippie generation, like our parents' generation, attempted to solve a lot of problems of going up the tree of life and evolving the complexity of society by going backwards. Because it's easy to look back at the past and be like, hey, what worked in the past? But we're on this rapid evolutionary course as a society and as a planet, as a species, where we can't go back without devastation. We can go back, we like blow ourselves to kingdom come and like go back to the Stone Age. But other than that, we can't go back. But we have to go forward in some way, because where we're at right now is not working. So the mind has to have a higher solution that it can pull in. Otherwise, we're just going to look backwards and try and find the answers in the past. And that never works. It doesn't. History shows us we can't go backwards without a lot of suffering, with a lot of pain. So one more thing. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, so that, in keeping with that, something that's really helpful to understand is that all of the solutions that we need, not just, I was saying we already have technological solutions, but all the solutions that we need actually already exist as spirit. Like all those patterns and blueprints are already within us. And so part of the essence of mastering the mind and clearing out all this junk that's sitting between us and our soul and our spirit is a matter of being able to like bring in what's already there and be able to bring that here, because that intelligence and everything that we need is already there at some level within us. But we have to be able to do that work within our lower minds and within our subconscious to clear that out enough so that we can actually bring in the blueprints that we already have.
Yeah, that's definitely a huge piece of it is realizing what's right here. This is enough. This is what's happening. But it's not enough if we don't realize it. It's not enough if we're not awake to it. It's not enough if it's just sleeping in a closet somewhere.
No. Like
we have to be living it. My dreams of last year that are now my life didn't just randomly become my life. I had to take totally radically different action steps to get where I am today. And to get where I want to go by the end of the year, same thing. I'm going to have to do stuff really differently. I think it was also Einstein who said, like, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing again and again and expecting different results. We're not going to get that Shambhala world peace, better life, cleaner mind by doing the same thing again and again and again. It just doesn't work like that. So we have to take a different set of steps to make the mind our friend. So cool. We're over our time here. So thank you for coming on, dear sister. I love you a lot. And
love you too.
Thank you everyone for watching tonight. We'll be back next week with actually a cool podcast on how to be yourself with Aaron Wallace, who's another senior guide and Kabbalah instructor from California. So stay tuned, everyone. Have a wonderful night. Again, my name is Jordan Bain. This is Ariana Bain. This podcast is called Unveiling. Check out my website, healingboston.com. And if you want to meditate with me, meditate with Jordan, Jordan, meditatewithjordan.com. Take care. Remember to subscribe to our podcast so you get notified about these events in the future. Have a great night.